In political science, the term social engineering refers to top-down efforts to influence particular attitudes and social behaviors on a large scale. Social engineering has a strong association with collectivism, conformism, communism, and totalitarianism. It was adopted by the social reformers involved in the American eugenics movement during the Progressive Era, which also brought compulsory schooling to America. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union used social engineering to replace the old social frameworks of the Russian Empire with a new Soviet culture, and to develop what was known as the New Soviet Person, which was a theoretical concept describing a citizen with specific qualities that were in keeping with current affairs and industrial trends. Qualities which tended to be in the orbit of obedience, conformity, open-mindedness, collectivism, and being unencumbered by traditions. Social engineering has been used in many other totalitarian regimes, including Nazi Germany and Maoist China. In the book, Social Engineering, authors Robert W. Giel and Sean T. Lawson argue that while social engineering was seen as well-intended in early 20th century America, by mid-century it was becoming a pejorative. And by the end of the century, mass social engineering was seen as a failure at best, and the path to totalitarianism at worst, dismissed as mere propaganda or feared as a cynical attempt to control the public. The authors also point out that even two of the most important figures working in the field, Ed Bernays and Ivy Lee, warned that social engineering could be used for good or evil, to promote or to subvert democracy. Did the golden age of social engineering come to an end as the result of misguided policy, or was it the result of deliberate abuse of power? By considering some of the important events leading into the emergence of social engineering in America in latter 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as the social context in which it was used, we get a very good sense for what the answer to this question is. In 1875, Wilhelm Wundt, widely known as the father of psychology, established the world's first psychological laboratory at Leipzig University in Germany. Wundt mentored over 100 graduate students at Leipzig, some of whom went on to become very prominent themselves. In his book, The Leipzig Connection, Paolo Leoni describes Leipzig as a flourishing center of culture and the sciences, each of its universities a magnet for the ambitious intellectual youth of Europe and the United States. Adding that, Wundt's thesis laid the philosophical basis for the principles of conditioning later developed by Pavlov, who studied physiology in Leipzig in 1884, 5 years after Wundt had inaugurated his laboratory there, and American behavioral psychologists such as Watson and Skinner, for lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy, for schools oriented more toward the socialization of the child than toward the development of intellect. The list of Wundt's students is a who's who of early European and American psychologists. In succeeding years, one could go to almost any major European or American university and study the new psychology with a professor who had received his PhD directly from Wundt at Leipzig. The Wundtian method, also known as introspection, aimed to better understand the structure of conscious experience by creating a more objective process to study it, emphasizing controlled, systematic observations in a lab setting, often involving the measuring of physiologic responses to experimental stimuli. Introspection laid the groundwork for psychology as an experimental science, the birth of educational psychology and child development, and the foundation of the pedagogy in the new public school system in America. Thus, public schools began providing a function previously provided by parents and the community: socialization. Teachers were taught how to elicit specific responses deemed socially desirable while subduing responses deemed undesirable. Who determined what was desirable and undesirable, and how they determined this, is anyone's guess. Teachers learned this new pedagogy at institutions like the Rockefeller Endowed Teachers College, which moved to Columbia University in New York in 1893, where it exploded in both size and scope, becoming the nation's first, largest, and most comprehensive graduate school of education, health, and of course, psychology. The new American school system soon began to turn out students whose values were much more in keeping with the predominant economic interests and the industrial economy in general. Among the most meticulous and comprehensive research on this topic came from John Taylor Gatto, who was named New York City Teacher of the Year multiple times and also earned the New York State Teacher of the Year award in 1991, the same year he resigned from teaching permanently. According to Gatto, the stated aims of those who brought forced schooling to America was to deliver only a very basic education for the vast majority, keeping them relatively uninformed, promoting materialism, conformity, and reflexive obedience to authority above all else. Gatto's research includes copious quotes from the aforementioned Foundation's own documents, all manner of pertinent media from that era, and 3 critical multi-volume documents the Foundations produced in concert with universities, state education departments, and the U.S. Department of Education, which outlined the way education was to be carried out in the United States. One of these documents, the Behavioral Teacher Education Project, included the stated aim of nothing less than the impersonal manipulation, through schooling, of a future America in which few will be able to maintain control over their opinion. For this and more on Gatto's research, see the link in the description below, entitled John Taylor Gatto on the Creation of the American Public School. Whether you want to call this real education or not, there's no denying it's a very different brand of education than the one that existed in America prior to the arrival of forced public schooling. This would be one thing if the American school system had been optional. Unfortunately, that was not the case, and not surprisingly, compulsory schooling was fiercely opposed, especially in communities where it clashed with local traditions and family dynamics, such as agrarian communities or those with strong religious beliefs. Compliance was enforced by truancy officers, who were tasked with physically escorting children to school if they were found working on farms or playing outside during school hours, as they had so often done in the past. Gradually, many prominent observers began writing about the misuse of the emerging behavior modification and social conditioning techniques. In fact, this came to a head in the wake of World War II and through the 1950s, and even included a major congressional investigation in the United States, which concluded in 1954. In 1945, Karl Popper's seminal work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, was published. Having been influenced by the disastrous consequences of the totalitarian ideologies of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, Popper distinguishes between what he calls utopian social engineering and piecemeal social engineering. Popper argued that utopian social engineering tended to lead to authoritarianism or totalitarianism and the suppression of dissent in the name of achieving the greater good. Piecemeal social engineering, on the other hand, involves incremental, small-scale changes to address specific problems rather than overly ambitious, totalizing efforts to overhaul society as a whole. In 1950, Norbert Wiener, widely known as the father of cybernetics, warned against the misuse of behavior modification principles for manipulative purposes in his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, stressing the importance of respecting human autonomy and dignity. In 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism was published. The author, Hannah Arendt, was one of the most influential political theorists of the 20th century, known especially for her attempts to explain how ordinary people become involved in totalitarian systems. In the book, in which Pavlovian conditioning is a key theme, Arendt shows specifically how totalitarian systems in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia used Pavlovian conditioning principles to suppress individual will and autonomy, erode personal identity and moral judgment, and teach citizenry to respond reflexively rather than think critically or independently. See the link in the description below, entitled Hannah Arendt on the Rise of Mass Propaganda and Totalitarian Education. 1951 was also the year the Asch conformity experiments and Swarthmore College began. These experiments studied the degree to which individuals yielded to peer pressure and a majority group opinion. The following year, The Impact of Science on Society was published, written by Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell. In the book, Russell emphasizes the ethical responsibilities of social scientists, behaviorists, and educators in using their knowledge for empowerment rather than control. Russell's black snow metaphor illustrates the idea that even absurd beliefs can be implanted with varying levels of effort. Russell's warning resonates today in discussions about the role of psychological manipulation in mass media, social media, and education systems, in shaping public opinion, suppressing critical thinking, and enforcing orthodoxy. The following excerpt is another, among many, that illustrate this point. What is essential in mass psychology is the art of persuasion. If you compare a speech of Hitler's with a speech of, say, Edmund Burke, you will see what strides have been made in the art since the 18th century. What went wrong formerly was that people had read in books that man is a rational animal and framed their arguments on this hypothesis. We now know that limelight and a brass band do more to persuade than can be done by the most elegant train of syllogisms. See the link in the description below entitled Bertrand Russell Warns of the Rise of Mass Psychology and Totalitarianism. That same year, 1952, a congressional committee began its investigation into the industrial giants of that time, notably Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford. The committee, called the Reese Committee, concluded in its final report in 1954 that these industrialists were using their tax-exempt foundations and grant-making power to influence the American education system. This report, named the Dodd Report, alluded to this as a revolution, which opposed American traditions and its independent esprit. More specifically, this included the following bullet points: directing education in the United States toward an international viewpoint and discrediting the traditions to which it formerly had been dedicated. Decreasing the dependency of education upon the resources of the local community and freeing it from many of the natural safeguards inherent in this American tradition. Changing both school and college curricula to the point where they sometimes denied the principles underlying the American way of life. The report also stated that this revolutionary change could not have occurred peacefully or with the consent of the majority, unless education in the United States had been prepared in advance to endorse it. In 1958, a book from René Wormser, who had been general counsel to the committee, was published, called Foundations: Their Power and Influence. In the book, Wormser describes an emerging elite with vast financial resources and unchecked, unaccountable power, which he described as being concentrated increasingly in the hands of an interlocking and self-perpetuating group. Wormser further writes in the book, "It is difficult for the public to understand that some of the great foundations which have done so much for us in some fields have acted tragically against the public interest in others. The power of the individual foundation giant is enormous. When there is like-mindedness among a group of these giants, which apparently is due to the existence of a closely knit group of professional administrators in the social science field, the power is magnified hugely. When such foundations do good, they justify the tax-exempt status which the people grant them. When they do harm, it can be immense harm." In 1956, the best-known work of Dutch-American doctor of medicine and psychoanalyst Joost Meerloo was published. In this book, The Rape of the Mind, Meerloo argues that Pavlov's findings provided a scientific basis that was weaponized by totalitarian leadership. Through repeated exposure to psychological stressors, totalitarian leaders in Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany broke down the mental resistance of citizenry and ultimately undermined their autonomy. See the link in the description below entitled Joost Meerloo on the use of Pavlovian conditioning and thought control in totalitarianism. Just a few years after Meerloo's book, one of the most interesting allusions to the use of Pavlovian conditioning in totalitarian systems came in a talk given by Aldous Huxley at UC Berkeley in 1962. In the talk, Huxley describes the suggestibility studies, which had revealed that about 20% of the population is highly suggestible, while a similar amount were the opposite, with about a 60% majority in the middle who were moderately suggestible. Huxley further points out that it's a good thing human suggestibility is normally distributed in this fashion, as this fosters stability in society. But Huxley, like many other prominent observers at the time, also mentions the Pavlovian method, which makes people more vulnerable to suggestion, and the obvious political significance this kind of information has in the hands of unscrupulous leadership. See the link in the description below entitled 1962 Aldous Huxley on Suggestibility Studies and the Pavlovian Method. A couple of months after Huxley made this speech at UC Berkeley, the Milgram experiments at Yale University ended, which studied the degree to which participants would obey authority figures instructing them to perform acts which conflicted with their conscience. In 1971, B.F. Skinner's book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, was published. In it, Skinner argues that free will was hindering the creating of a perfect society, a utopia, and that scientific methods to modify behavior, or what he called cultural engineering, were necessary to complete the task. This came as little surprise, since decades earlier, Skinner's 1948 utopian novel, Walden 2, had also espoused behavior modification and a rejection of free will. In 1929, when he was a 25-year-old graduate student, B.F. Skinner attended a lecture at Harvard Medical School given by Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. Skinner wrote about this occasion in his autobiography, which also contained many other allusions to the man who had influenced his thinking so much. Here's an excerpt. I heard Pavlov's presidential address in German, but did not try to shake his hand. I did get his autograph. A photographer was taking orders for a portrait and had asked Pavlov to write his name on a slip of paper so that his signature could appear on each print. I offered to buy a copy if I could have the slip of paper when the photographer was through with it, and he sent it to me. Besides Pavlov, Skinner had also been inspired by John B. Watson, the very founder of behaviorism, and American psychologist Edward Thorndike, who spent most of his career at Teachers College in New York. In fact, Thorndike's ideas about behavior modification, and especially his law of effect, provided the basis for Skinner's operant conditioning theories. It has become clear today that Skinner's belief in cultural conditioning and rejection of free will are increasingly popular ideas for whatever interests control the media in America, where propaganda, misinformation, and gaslighting run rampant. This polarizing, ambiguous messaging, and the overt suppression of dissent we've recently seen in social media are telltale signs of a totalitarian trend, as they contribute to widespread fear, anxiety, and cognitive dissonance, which prepare the citizenry for imminent paradigm shifts which would not otherwise have been tolerated. In both Maoist China and Stalinist Russia, citizens faced with the conflict between their personal observations of famine and repression and the official state narrative of progress and prosperity resolved the conflict by convincing themselves that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the country, even though this contradicted observable reality. In America today, if the media has it right, we are a people who struggle to understand what global temperatures are doing and how many genders there are. We are a people who very suddenly and radically changed our beliefs about how science and medicine work. We're even a people who are cultivating a renewed interest in aliens and UFOs. At some point, we too will lie to ourselves by adjusting our beliefs in order to alleviate the dissonance created by ambiguous, if not absurd, media messaging. Over time, we too will become very adept at coping, very adept at lying to ourselves. And if we will lie to ourselves about these things, what else might we lie to ourselves about? By entertaining stupid ideas on a regular basis, we get good at it. Who knows? Perhaps we might eventually find ourselves conceding to overreaching policies we would never otherwise have been receptive to, like owning nothing and still being happy, or having brain-computer interfaces installed in our bodies so we don't become irrelevant and obsolete. Perhaps eventually, it won't bother us to see things closely correlated with freedom and independence, like keeping livestock, collecting rainwater, or pursuing forms of alternative energy, becoming increasingly difficult or off-limits entirely. Perhaps we, too, will increasingly see the value in suffering, for the good of the whole, of course. Perhaps dissenting opinions will actually become widely frowned upon. We will come to value elaborate systems of punishment for those who dare to stray outside of the culturally sanctioned playpen of virtuous thoughts and deeds. Of course, dwelling on or obsessing with these developments should be avoided at all costs, lest we become part of the problem ourselves, part of an already fearful, anxious, and divided citizenry. But it won't do to ignore these developments either, for reasons that I believe are self-evident. It's also good to remember, as Huxley pointed out in the aforementioned talk at UC Berkeley, we're very fortunate that human suggestibility is distributed normally. Both margins, as well as the middle of that bell curve, all play an important role for social stability. It's those with the motive and the power to alter the shape of that normal distribution that we should be the most concerned about. If they ever do succeed in creating a paradigm in which no one ever asked any questions, then that distribution won't be normal any longer. And let's just be honest, the world would be a very dull place without them.
There's no one on the world diplomatic stage that uses the word evildoers. That was special. What the hell is that? It's like some medieval movie. Sire, the evildoers are at the gates! The evildoers are attacking! We're not domestic spying. We're not domestic spying, ladies and gentlemen. But we are listening in on the evildoers so we can find out what evil deeds the evildoers are planning on doing, because that's what evildoers do, hence the name evildoers.
Not once have these super intelligent aliens ever been sighted around Orlando. They don't land around Times Square in New York City. Evidently, these super intelligent aliens, after traveling millions of miles to get here, have no interest in seeing Disney World or a Broadway play. No. They make this long trip every time just so they can land next to a hog pen in Arkansas. And then we end up with some news reporter interviewing a pig farmer. Yeah, I seen it. And all of a sudden I looked up and saw that UFO. I noticed that the closer it got, the bigger it got.
I saw the other day a person saying, "Don't call me he or she, call me they." It took me 3 years to learn I am, you are, he is, she. This whole gender neutral pronoun is confusing for me. Let me tell you a story. I invited a friend to have dinner at my house the other day. And he was like, "Oh, I'm bringing a friend." And I said, "Of course, bring him." He was like, No, bring them. So I bought a lot of food. I bought briskets and pizzas and pastas. And my friend showed up at my house with one person. So I said, "Where are they?" And he said, "They are here." So you tell them that they're gonna eat all of this food.
We're not.
The rest of them are all lying about me taking horse medication. And we should talk about that.
That bothered you.
It should bother you, too. They're lying at your network about people taking human drugs versus drugs for veterinary.
Calling it a horse dewormer is not a flattering thing. I get that.
It's a lie. It's a lie on a news network, and it's a lie that's a willing... That's a lie that they're conscious of. This is not a mistake.
Yeah.
They're unfavorably framing it as veterinary medicine.
Well, the FDA put this thing out. You saw that. Did you see that thing that the FDA put out?
What did the FDA put out?
It was a tweet, and it was snarky. I admit it. They said, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow, stop taking this stuff," or something like that.
Why would you say that when you're talking about a drug that's been given out to billions and billions of people, a drug that was responsible for one of the inventors of it making winning the Nobel Prize in 2015?
Yeah.
Yeah, a drug that has been shown to stop viral replication in vitro. You know that, right? Why would they lie and say that's horse dewormer?
All right, hang on. The thing is, we're like going so fast. Like I feel like I'm missing.
Do you think that's a problem, that your news network lies?
Well, I don't.
Dude,
what did they say?
They lied and said I was taking horse dewormer. First of all, it was prescribed to me by a doctor.
Yeah.
Along
they
with
shouldn't have said
a
it was
bunch of other medications.
If you got a human pill, because there were people that were taking the veterinary medication, and you're not, obviously. You got it from a doctor, so that it shouldn't be called that. Ivermectin can be a very effective medication for parasitic disease. And as you say, it's probably, I think what, 250 million people have taken it around the world.
More,
I get that.
Way more.
So
way more. Billions of people have taken it.
Can I just come back to the one I want to talk about? Two things
no.
on the ledger.
You have, before we get to that, does it bother you that the news network you work for out and out lied, just outright lied about me taking horse dewormer?
They shouldn't have said that.
Why did they do that?
I don't know.
You didn't ask? You didn't think that was you're the medical guy over there. This is your news network.
I'm going to watch.
Let's see.
I'm going to watch.
Rogan telling his 13 million Instagram followers that he was treated with several drugs, and he included ivermectin on the list, a drug used for livestock.
It can be used for humans. I get it. I totally...
Not just could be used for humans, is often used for humans, along with all the other drugs I took. All human drugs.
Yes.
They know it's a human drug.
It's right. But
they lied.
This, to me, is the clue to understanding something that is personally fascinating, and it revolves around why people believe such weird things. There is no longer a commonality of understanding. I mean, for some people, quantum physics provides the answers. Their next-door neighbor may look to the channeling of archangels with equal fervor. And so into that dimension of anxiety created by this inability to parse reality rushes a bewildering variety of squirrely notions. Epistemological cartoons. It's the live and let live, laid-back approach to doing intellectual heavy lifting. I have to defer. It allows stuff like Heaven's Gate. It allows Jonestown. Nobody ever said to those people, "You're full of shit. Don't think like this. This will lead to catastrophe." Instead, people said, "Hey, cool. See you in the sky." And people say, "Well, but now this sounds like you're advocating acrimonious and emotionally painful judgment making that will leave some of us disenfranchised from our belief in the space people or the presence of great Atlantis or something else that's very cherished." Yes. Yes. We have loosened our girdings sufficiently, folks. We are now open-minded enough. You don't want to become so open-minded that the wind can whistle between your ears. We have been taught that political correctness demands that we treat all these things with equal weight. The enemy that will really subvert the enterprise of building a world based on clarity is the belief that we cannot point out the pernicious forms of idiocy that flourish in our own community. And to me, all of these things are intelligence tests. And the people who pass the intelligence test are not worrying about pro bono proctologists from other star systems showing unannounced in their bedrooms. So, we have perfected politeness. Now I think it's time to refine our mathematical skills, learn to think straight, and not be afraid to denounce the pernicious forms of foolishness which are vitiating the energies of our community and making us appear marginal and absurd in the discourse about truly transforming society.